Ah, banana phone. Trusty, reliable banana phone. You've never let me down. You don't rot. You don't drop my calls. And you get pretty decent service out here in the middle of the woods. So here's the deal. I'm going to give you a little treat. I'm going to call somebody right here, right now on this beautiful October day. Here we go. Hey, hello, Sarah. How's it going? Guess what? You're on a show in the woods.
Hey, Sal. It's great to be here.
All right, Sarah. So for those who don't know you, how would you describe yourself?
My name is Sarah Larsen. I'm originally from Grand Marais, Minnesota, but now I live in the Willmar area, and I teach mostly ninth grade English.
So what made you want to become a teacher?
So I discovered when I graduated, I was lucky enough I attended a really, really small school, and they saved our assignments from the time that we first arrived at school in kindergarten. They kept a few key assignments every year, and when we graduated, they gave us this big portfolio. And I found an essay from myself in 5th grade explaining why I wanted to be a teacher. So I think I've kind of always wanted it. I didn't always know it was going to be high school, but I've always enjoyed school. I've always really liked kids. I love to read. It just fits.
So what's the school you teach at right now like?
I teach in Willmar, Minnesota, which is a kind of medium-sized town about 2 hours west of the Twin Cities. So by medium-sized, I mean the town population is about 20,000. There's just a little bit more than 1,000 students who attend the school where I teach. And they're a pretty diverse group. People tend to think that rural Minnesota is a lot of white people, and it is more white people than it might be in other parts of the country. But Willmar is a town with a turkey processing plant, so there are a lot of recent immigrants who live there, particularly refugees. So my population tends to be about half white, about 30-ish% Latino students, and about 20-ish% Somali, and we're starting to see more and more Karen refugees in the community as well, coming from Myanmar.
So what's the size of your classroom?
Well, my biggest class that I have right now is 32 students. The biggest I've ever had is 34. And my smallest class right now is 25. I think the smallest I've ever had is 21.
And how do you feel about that number? Is that a manageable amount?
I think ideally, like in a perfect world, I would never have more than 30 students in a class. But in general, I will say my school has done a pretty good job of making sure that I don't have that many students in my ninth grade classes, which is good because they have a few more needs. So the smaller class sizes with the ninth graders is better. I can give them more individual attention, and it's easier to deal with. Ninth graders are a little bit more prone to exuberance, shall we say, than older students. So I don't mind it too much.
So you mentioned about the diversity of your classroom, and I think that's just great. I think that's fantastic. I'm curious, have you noticed any sort of impact it's had on your students' learning experience?
I think it's really, really awesome. We live in a world where schools are increasingly segregated, and I feel really lucky that I get to teach in one of the few schools in America anymore that really aren't segregated. It means that, my students who might otherwise not spend time with people who don't look or think like them, it broadens their minds and forces them to interact and think about other people in different ways and learn about different cultures. I think it's awesome. I do see students self-segregating somewhat, especially students who are newer immigrants tend to stick with folks who speak their language and follow their customs. But in general, I've been really impressed with how much students are willing to hang out with and work with and learn from each other, no matter where they're from or what language they speak. Last year, I had a bunch of students. They were doing a choice group book project. I had, I think, 7 books for them to choose from, and they picked their own book, and they made a little book club. And I had a Latino student who'd been in the country for a long time and one who didn't speak English as well. And so my student who was born here but spoke Spanish from her parents was able to help him out while they worked with a couple of white students, and I think there was one Somali student in the group, and they were all able to work together and help each other out while they made this movie about these. The book was called Orphan Train, partially about a girl who's a foster child and doesn't really fit in, and all of the students could see themselves as different aspects of the story. So it was really neat to watch them process this story about trying to find the place you belong through their different lenses. It was really cool.
So what are some of the ways that you've adapted your teaching style in response to the COVID-19 pandemic?
Oh gosh, well, I'm a fairly newer teacher. This is year 4 for me, so it's been a bit of a challenge. I would say it's been as much of a challenge for newer teachers as for older teachers to adapt to this. But for myself, we've had to move to hybrid, and for us we're doing what's called synchronous hybrid, which means that half of my students are in my classroom at any given time, and half of them are on a Zoom call participating in class virtually with me. And it has pushed me to look into really working in more ways of pulling all of my students into being engaged. So I've been doing a lot more breakout rooms within the Zoom, or what we sometimes call in education think, pair, share, where you give the kids a question and then a partner, and they have a couple of minutes to talk about things before they come back to the big group for discussion. So we've been doing a lot of breakout rooms, and I've been leaning quite a bit on popsicle sticks. I wrote all of my students' names on popsicle sticks, and I pull the popsicle sticks to ask the kids their opinion about stuff. So that can be really embarrassing if you use popsicle sticks to call on students for questions that have a right or a wrong answer. But if it's just an opinion question, and if they've had some time to think about it, it's a really good way to make sure that everybody is involved and everybody's engaged. So I've been using that more and more to make sure that I'm not just talking to my students in person or just my students online. I've also found some really, really cool tools that my students can use whether they're at home or at school. Things like Nearpod, which I'd experimented with a little bit before, but had never really gotten into. Are you familiar with Nearpod?
Oh, I don't know. What is Nearpod?
So Nearpod is software that schools can buy licenses to. It's essentially an addition onto Google Slides. So I can insert, say, quiz questions. My students would log into the Nearpod with a code that I give them, and then the slides that I'm presenting, they see on their iPads or Chromebooks. Our school, we use iPads. They could also see it on a cell phone if they logged in that way. I can either do it as what we call a live lesson, or I can do it as what we call a self-paced lesson. So if it's self-paced, I just give kids the code, and then on their own time, they log in and go through the slides. So I just made one. My older students are going to start reading Macbeth, so I made some videos with multiple choice questions and short answer questions about what they watched on the videos. It's got polls for their opinions on certain questions. It has virtual field trips, which are kind of cool. So there are the panorama shots of different places, so the students can move their iPads around, and it's like they're visiting another location. So I put in some virtual tours of Scottish castles, and you can also do quiz questions. You can do fill-in-the-blank stuff. You can do matching pairs. There's all sorts of activities that you can throw in there to make the lessons more engaging for kids. So it's a really good way to enrich what you're doing in the classroom for students, whether they're at home or in person.
So I'm curious, what kind of resources were provided to the students at your school that they needed in order to learn in this sort of hybrid school setup?
When we went to distance learning in the spring, at least in the state of Minnesota, it seems like the consensus was, and maybe this isn't true for everybody, but I know in our district, we're a high poverty district. Over 60% of our students receive free and reduced lunch, and we knew that many of our families did not have access to the internet, or at least high enough quality access to the internet that they would be able to log into live lessons all the time. So we were told that we had to do asynchronous instruction in the spring, that we could not host required live classes for attendance. We could hold Zoom meetings, but we had to record them, and we couldn't tie any grades to attendance because it was an equity issue. Not all students would be able to do that, would be able to log in or join at certain times. We basically had to create videos and assignments and just post it and hope that kids would do it on their own time. And some kids did really well with it, but most teenagers are not fantastic at time management. There are exceptions. I'm not here to hate on teenagers, but they, as a group, I've never had so many students fail because they just weren't doing it, you know. It was hard for them to connect with their teacher. It was hard for them to connect with their classmates. Many of them had a lot of responsibilities that they were asked to pick up at home, or they were starting to take on extra shifts at work. It became a real problem. So as far as what did the school provide, our school has been providing iPads for students in grades 7 through 12 to take home with them for a while now, and they offered iPads to students in grades K through 6 in school, but they couldn't take their iPads home. I think they are now allowing younger students to take their iPads home to make sure that they have access to their digital classes. We're just now making the transition to hybrid. But we also had a van that would go out to students who didn't have Wi-Fi. We set up hotspots in all of the school parking lots so that families could come and they could park in the parking lot and the kids could download their assignments and watch the videos that they needed to watch, and then they could go home and complete the assignments and come back and then upload them, send them to their teachers, download the next set of assignments, and the vans that would go out to students who are pretty rural. Now we're expecting students to attend class synchronously every day on the days that they're not in person. So I think the expectation was that parents had to get Wi-Fi, essentially. I know that several companies were offering Wi-Fi free for low-income families. Actually, all public housing, as I understand it, has Wi-Fi. So my students who are living in public housing had that. But we've always been providing the technology, and I believe our public library now offers hotspots that kids can check out the Wi-Fi. So it's not a perfect solution, but none of my students so far have come to me and said, I can't attend class because we don't have Wi-Fi.
So is there enough protections out there to keep the students and staff of your school healthy?
You're asking this at a fascinating time, Alex, because San Diego County, where I teach, as we're recording this, I think the date is October 17th today. The last time the numbers came out, San Diego County had the third highest rate of COVID-19 in the state. The governor's recommendation is that if you have more than 50 cases per 10,000 in your county, that you should go distance learning. So as I said, our elementary schools are just now transitioning to hybrid, and we had a big meeting about this on Wednesday. We are, as long as there is no provable transmission from student to student or student to staff or vice versa at school, we're going to, so my administration tells me, we're going to try to stay open in the hybrid model. I am nervous about that. I fully recognize that students do better when they can physically go to school. It's really hard to get work done at home. I'm not very productive when I'm at home. I have a lot of sympathy and a lot of empathy for students and families, especially for younger students. I can't imagine the difficulties of not only trying to find childcare, but on the days that you can be home with your kids, of trying to help them with school and with distance learning. That would be a real challenge. So I understand that the jump to distance learning is really daunting and really difficult for the school district and for families. And I will say that I think the school where I work has been doing a really good job of trying to keep transmission, or trying to prevent transmission. They're very aggressive about if a student tests positive, making sure that not only that they don't come to school, but that anyone who they could potentially have even possibly exposed doesn't come to school. They're really good about sanitizing things. They've provided a lot of cleaning supplies for us. They gave masks to all the students. I believe the school is doing the best that they can, but a lot of my job has turned into telling kids to keep their masks up and, yeah, I know you're in the hallway. I know you're coming back from the bathroom, but even then, you got to keep your mask on. Like, it's really hard. It's hard for kids. And it's hard for teachers, and I'm kind of nervous.
Well, I hope people stay as safe as they can be, but I also recognize it is tough. It's a tough situation all around.
And people are doing their best. Kids are doing their best. Administration's doing their best. Teachers are doing their best. It's hard for everybody. Mm-hmm. So all we can do is, I guess, hope for a vaccine and for better protective policies and more widespread testing, better support for families when students are on distance learning.
How do you think teaching will change in the long term in a post-pandemic world?
I really think that some families are going to discover that distance learning works better for them, and that some families will choose to do online school. Some parents are, especially with younger kids, some parents are starting to look into homeschooling who wouldn't have otherwise, and they're either discovering that it works really well for their family or that it doesn't. The last time I checked, I could be wrong about this, but public school enrollment has gone down with all of this. I think a lot of families have either started looking into homeschooling or charter schools or private schools that are offering in-person instruction, and I think that will have lasting consequences, because so much of public school funding is based on how many students are enrolled in a given school at a given time. So if we continue to see that trend of decreasing public school enrollment, that could have very negative effects. Another thing that could have very negative effects on America's public schools, Education Minnesota, the largest teacher union in the state, just posted a survey that showed that 29% of the 10,000 teachers who took that survey were thinking about leaving the profession, either quitting or retiring early. And pension and benefit requests are up 35% from this same time last year. So we're seeing a lot of teachers, especially older teachers, the most experienced teachers are leaving. We have a huge shortage of substitutes. I think we are coming to a crisis point in education. We're seeing fewer and fewer students choosing education as a major. We're seeing a decrease in the number of parents who say that they would want their child to become a teacher. It's a profession that I think it's at a point of change right now. So I'll be really interested to see where that goes. I don't want to make any sort of predictions about that right now. As far as the act of teaching and the act of learning, one big thing that I was just talking with my partner about, who's also a teacher, is that I think we've seen the end of snow days. We won't have school canceled for bad weather anymore. It'll be called a distance learning day. And students will Zoom in with their teachers. And on the one hand, as a teacher, I'm like, yes, we won't have to make up those days in the summer anymore. And on the other hand, there's something profoundly sad about that. This thing that was an aspect of American life, especially for those of us who live in the upper Midwest, it's been an aspect of our life for a really long time. So there's some loss there. But I am really excited about some of the really cool technological tools like Nearpod that I told you about. I think we'll see more growth in that. But I think we're also seeing the value of the connection that students have with their teachers and the value of time spent in school. So hopefully we will also see increases in the value that people are placing on education and schools as a whole, and that will lead to increased school funding so schools can offer more services.
So what are some of the ways the American public can help its teachers?
Well, the biggest thing that people in the general public can do would be to vote for politicians and policies that would increase funding for schools. We've asked schools to take on so much in the last few decades. And schools have pretty consistently stepped up to the plate. What they have provided hasn't always been perfect, but when the pandemic hit and when schools were closed, almost all of the arguments that I saw for keeping schools open were things like students need social interaction. What about the students who are not safe at home? What about students who need food? What about students who need mental health counseling or need medication given to them at a regular time and they're, for whatever reason, they can't get that at home? Like, there were any number of things that got brought up about why schools are important, and very little of it had to actually do with education or the quality of education that students receive. So I think providing more services for kids and families in and outside of school, as well as making sure that schools have the funding that they need to take care of students and to pay teachers what they deserve, that would be huge. I think this is a whole other thing, but teacher training should be overhauled. So many young teachers are burning out. 50% of people who go into the profession leave within 3 years because it's so overwhelming, and the training that teachers are given is frankly inadequate and outdated. So some better teacher training would be awesome. I would also really love to see more positive messages about schools. When I log on to social media, and I understand this, we all went to school, we all have had experiences at school that were good, and we've all had experiences at school that were bad. There's a lot of negative talk about the public schools and about how they're failing. And I think instead of asking what's wrong with schools and what's wrong with teachers, we should start asking what can we do to help. And parents, if you have a problem with your child's teacher, it'll happen, right? We do things. You might disagree with it. Come talk to us first before you talk to our principals. Most of the time, we're pretty reasonable people. So let us know.
Well, thank you, Sarah, so much for being willing to sit down and have a chat with me. I hope things go over well and you stay safe and your students stay safe and healthy, and that they learn lots of interesting and important things.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thanks for listening to me ramble, and thanks for supporting teachers in education.
Yep. See ya. Bye.